Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar on peace, conflict, and national adaptation plan processes. My name is Orville Gray, and I am the head of the Secretariat for the NAP Global Network, and I'll be co-moderating today's session with my colleague, Katharina.
Hello, everyone. My name is Katharina Schmidt, and I'm a policy advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which hosts the Secretariat for the NAP Global Network. Thank you for joining us today. To get us started, a few housekeeping points. So today's session will be 60 minutes long. Simultaneous translation into French and Spanish is available and hopefully seen from your screen. Please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself by typing your name and affiliation in the chat box. And we are recording the session in English and will share the video and slides with participants as a follow-up. If you have any questions in the meantime, comments or technical issues, please just let us know also in the chat box.
Thanks, Katharina. Today's webinar is brought to you by the NAP Global Network. And in case this is your first time joining one of our events, the NAP Global Network was created in 2014 to support developing countries in advancing their NAP processes and help accelerate adaptation efforts around the world. To achieve this, the network facilitates South-South peer learning and exchange, supports national level action on NAP processes, and we aim to generate, synthesize, and share knowledge like today's webinar.
Again, on mute. 4 years of using this didn't help. Sorry for that. We have an exciting panel of speakers today who are here to share their expertise on climate change adaptation. So we'll be hearing from first Alec Crawford, who's Director Nature for Resilience at ISD and the NAP Global Network. Since joining ISD in 2004, Alec's work has focused on several core areas of sustainable development policy and practice. He works extensively on climate change adaptation through the whole NAP Global Network. Afterwards, we are fortunate to be joined by two guest speakers. First, Prakash Bista, who is an adaptation planning specialist with UNDP's Climate Hub. He has been supporting development countries advance their NAP processes since 2013. Prakash has a keen interest in the intersection of climate change and conflict and has contributed, among others, to the OECD's policy paper on forced displacement in climate change adaptation. Next, Gerty Pierre, who is Haiti's Director of Climate Change in the Ministry of Environment, and will share with us Haiti's experiences with integrating peace-building considerations into the NAP process. So first, we'll hear from Alec Crawford, who will present the guidance developed by ISD and NAP Global Network on how governments can operationalize peace-building context operationalize NAP processes in peace-building contexts, and can design and implement the NAP process in a way that responds to peace and conflict dynamics they are experiencing. We'll also hear from Gerty Pierre, who will share Haiti's experience with NAPs, peace and stability. Then we will hear from Prakash Bista, who will explain discussing UNDP's strategic approach in integrating climate resilience and peace building. After the presentations, we have approximately 15 minutes to answer and discuss questions from you. So please feel free and don't be shy to engage. Alec, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Katharina. So as mentioned, there's the agenda for the day. As also mentioned, my name is Alec Crawford. I'm the Director of Nature for Resilience with ISD and with the NAP Global Network. We want to take you today through a new piece of guidance that we've recently released on peace, conflict, and national adaptation plans. This guidance, which is broadly available online, draws on many years of experience that ISD's resilience team has in working at that intersection between climate change and conflict. The guidance was officially launched at the COP in Dubai at the US Center, but we're very happy to kind of do a virtual launch today as well. Why did we decide to do this? Well, we noticed within the NAP Global Network, if you're familiar with the network, that we had both kind of a growing attention to adaptation within conflict-affected states or fragile states. Most of that attention had been traditionally on financing and how more financing needs to flow into these countries. But we saw that there was a growing attention on action, and particularly requests from conflict-affected states or states struggling with instability or fragility to have some help when it came to their NAP processes. So what does the guidance aim to do? Well, it aims to do two things. So the guidance is really designed to both think through how you align your NAP process with perhaps a peace building process, if you have such a process underway within your country. And then secondly, how you integrate approaches to conflict sensitivity into your NAP to ensure that the adaptation actions that you're planning, implementing, and then of course monitoring, evaluating, and learning from do not contribute to instability in any way, but at a minimum, but better still that they contribute to enhancing peace building outcomes. So I'm going to take you through the guidance before we turn it over to our expert panel. So next slide, please. Why do we need to do this? Well, I think it should be obvious to many on this call that it's really those states, those communities, those populations that are affected by conflict, that are recovering from conflict or in the midst of conflict, that are acutely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. There's a strong correlation between this instability and, again, high levels of vulnerability to climate impacts and perhaps a low readiness to respond to the impacts of climate change. Within these contexts, we do not want to argue against the fact that it can be very difficult to prioritize adaptation actions. Governments that are within these kinds of contexts are often struggling with, obviously, the suspension of violence, the resumption of public services like education, health, the rebuilding of public infrastructure. Within these kinds of contexts, it can be very difficult to prioritize adaptation. But we also think that it would be a mistake to neglect to do so. Over the past 15 years, much research has been done on the links between climate change and violence and conflict. And if in a peace building context, you are ignoring these links and ignoring adaptation, you're potentially compromising the sustainability of your peace building process. So conflict and climate change also, these risks are often share the same drivers. They can be mutually reinforcing. Of course, conflict can erode adaptive capacity when it comes to climate change, while climate change can be a driving force or contributing factor towards violence. But we see adaptation as potentially a way of breaking that vicious cycle, and that investments in adaptation could instead really promote peace building at the local and national levels. Next slide, please. So just to go into some of the overlap that I was mentioning, on the left of this table, you can see the ranking of the Fragile States Index from the most recent year, 2023. And then on the right-hand side, from the ND Gain Index, you can see vulnerability to climate change. And as many of you will be able to note, the kind of highlighted orange countries are those that overlap between the two lists. So a strong correlation, again, between these measures of fragility and instability and vulnerability to climate change. Next slide, please. So within the NAP Global Network, one of the things that we do is we run a service called NAP Trends, which essentially looks at what is coming out of the NAP documents that have been submitted to the UNFCCC in terms of key themes like private sector engagement or gender equality and social inclusion. One of the things that we've been looking at lately is conflict and peace building and how these are being talked about in the NAPs that have been submitted to date. And as you can see here, this is out of just a few days ago. The number of NAPs that mention conflict in some way is about 78%. So there's quite strong focus on conflict within the NAPs that have been submitted to varying degrees, of course, depending on the country. But many are speaking about it. How exactly are they speaking of it? Well, we've found that of the 50 some odd NAPs that have been submitted to date, 11 of them are talking about conflict as a driver of vulnerability. 30 of them are, again, thinking about how conflict can result from climate impacts, and they see a real threat there. 7 are calling for a need for conflict-sensitive adaptation. 13 of the NAPs are talking about adaptation as a means of conflict prevention or peace building, so one of the tools in that peace building toolbox. And then finally, 2 of them are talking about conflicts that actually result from either maladaptation or poorly planned mitigation. But all told, as you can see, there is not an overwhelming focus within the NAP documents, but many NAP documents are starting to think about these conflict dynamics. Next slide, please. So here's just a few ways in which they're talking about it. So this is from the NAP from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And here you can see from the text, they say, by increasing poverty, displacement, immobility, and eroding social networks, conflicts contribute to the vulnerability of marginalized populations. Moreover, climate change could be a contributing factor to future conflicts, especially with regard to the scarcity of productive land and the lack of water. Next one, please. Here in South Sudan, you can see the impact of climate change, if unaddressed, could undo the hard-fought gains our country has achieved in terms of building peace and unity. Next one, this is from Burkina Faso, which was the first NAP that was submitted to the UNFCCC. And within that NAP, they say that a central objective of the livestock sector in particular, that adaptation plan includes promoting lasting social peace by reducing tensions relating to pastoral conflicts. So again, adaptation as a peace-building tool. In East Timor, there's quite a bit in this NAP around kind of conflict mediation and conflict resolution using traditional knowledge and traditional mechanisms. But within their NAP, they talk about incorporating perspectives and insights concerning reducing the risks of climate change-driven social unrest and insecurity. And one of the key guiding principles of this NAP is integrating climate change adaptation considerations into the nation building and recovery process. So very much trying to put adaptation near the center of peace building. And finally, going back to South Sudan, a healthy and resilient agriculture sector is critical for long-term peace and development. Therefore, incorporating climate change considerations into agriculture sector planning and investment indirectly contributes to peace and reconciliation. So just some of the language that's being used by countries when it comes to talking about conflict and peace within their NAPs. Why do we see a strong alignment between these two things? Well, both of them share a number of key characteristics. So if you're familiar with the NAP process, you know that it focuses on medium and long-term time horizons. And the same can be said of peace building. Peace building is not something that happens overnight. It's more a 10 to 20-year process, similar to what we're thinking about with the NAP. They also share many of the drivers when it comes to risks and vulnerability. So if you can address some of the drivers of climate vulnerability, you may also be addressing some of the drivers of conflict and instability. Of course, both processes have to be participative. They have to be country-owned. They have to be country-driven in order to succeed. This can't be imposed upon a country from outside, but rather have to really be owned by the population, by the governments themselves. And then finally, strengthened governance is really central to both a successful NAP process and a successful peace-building process. So strengthening those institutions, those institutional arrangements, and legal and policy frameworks is really going to be crucial to both processes. So within the guidance, we've looked at the NAP process as a whole, from planning to implementation to monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or MEL. And we've tried to identify 6 enabling factors that have to be in place in order for a NAP to be conflict sensitive and aligned with peace building, and then identify some of the entry points throughout that NAP process that can help with this. Filled with practical examples, of course. So when it comes to the enabling factors, we have 6. That we talk about in the guidance. We see leadership as being crucial to this. So, high-level political engagement in the NAP process and a desire at that high level to align NAPs with peace building, to align adaptation priorities with peace building priorities. Second is data, knowledge, and communications. All good adaptation policymaking, of course, is built on good climate information. And unfortunately, within these kinds of contexts, oftentimes the information is just not present. So you can go to the next slide, please. I'll just give an example of this. We did some research looking at the number of land surface climate stations within various countries. And here you can see that within many of the most fragile states in the world, states like Sudan, Central African Republic, Chad, the number of land surface climate stations that they have is really much, much lower than what is had in a more relatively stable country like Finland. So here, just to pull out 2 numbers, you can see that Afghanistan has 4 such stations generating climate information, whereas Finland has 922. So a vast difference for a country that is half the size of Afghanistan and has about 1/8 the population of Afghanistan. That said, there are many, open, globally available, free resources that countries can draw on to try to make up that deficit of information when they're struggling to emerge from conflict. Next slide, please. The third enabling condition is financing. So this isn't going to come as a surprise to anyone. You can go to the next slide already. But when it comes to financing for climate within fragile states, the UNDP came up with some numbers through their climate security mechanism. Looking at the $14 billion in international climate financing delivered across a 7-year time frame, they found that non-fragile states were getting about $161 per person, fragile states $10 per person, extremely fragile states $2 per person. So obviously a vast gulf exists between the amount of financing that is going into, let's say, a middle income, small developing state versus an extremely fragile situation. And you can understand why donors have reticence to do that, but still there's a need to increase that financing. Finally, we looked at institutional arrangements. So, ensuring that those who are driving a peace building process are talking to those who are driving the adaptation process, for example. Stakeholder engagement, you have to engage with not only kind of typical environmental sectors, the water sector, the agriculture sector, but you have to think about talking to the humanitarian sector and the security sector and the peace building sector. So it's a different context in which you're working within these kinds of fragile and conflict affected states. And finally, capacity building and development. So how do you build capacities both among the peace builders when it comes to climate change adaptation, but also within the adaptation community when it comes to peace building to ensure that everybody understands the perspectives of the other side. Next slide, please. So ideally, through using the guidance, we want to encourage this kind of conflict sensitive approach. And what do we mean by that? Conflict sensitivity is really about not exacerbating broader conflict dynamics through the interventions that you're doing. So how do you ensure that in the design, implementation, and MEL associated with adaptation coming out of the NAP process, that it is designed in such a way to integrate conflict dynamics and not exacerbate the situation. Ideally, you move from kind of, as you can see on this chart, working in a conflict situation, such as conflict sensitivity, to working on a conflict situation. So how can you, again, kind of move the design of your adaptation interventions so that they're actively trying to enhance peace building and are aligned with peace building rather than simply trying to do no harm. Next slide, please. So ideally, a conflict-sensitive NAP is a NAP process that integrates conflict and peace-building considerations into its design, implementation, and MEL to ensure that adaptation programming doesn't exacerbate conflict dynamics, but rather that it actively enhances and promotes peace building. Next slide, please. And just briefly to close, what we've done in the guidance is we've looked at the technical guidelines that were prepared by the Least Developed Country Expert Group, or the LEG, around NAP processes. And we've gone through those guidelines and identified in each step that is included in the guideline where entry points might exist for bringing in some of this conflict sensitivity thinking, some of this alignment with peace building thinking to really support governments in, again, bringing these risks, bringing these dynamics, bringing these opportunities into their NAP process to assure that it's again, aligned with their peace building objectives and that it, at the very least, does no harm. The next slide is just kind of a continuation of that table, but again, we kind of go through each of the steps in the technical guidelines and try to identify those entry points. I'll leave it there because I've spoken probably for longer than I should have, and we can go to Gerty. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alec, for this presentation. And again, to the audience, if you already have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll collect them later on. Now over to you, Gerty Pierre.
Good morning, everyone. I don't know if you can see me there. Okay, now. Yeah. So thank you for this opportunity and then to present our study that we made in Haiti about climate security. And then what this study was help us to better understand to carry out our NAP process and that we already undergoing in Haiti right now. But thank you for the invitation again, and then I will speak in French. The presentation will be in English, but I will speak in French. Okay, I hope there has translation because Christian said me, they have a translation. I don't have any problem to speak in French, all right?
Please go ahead. We have translation.
Thank you. Okay. So, uh, as you know, in Haiti, I'm working on for the Ministry of Environment and then working on climate change. I'm the director of climate change in Haiti. Um, Haïti, comme vous le savez, est un pays faible, à faible revenu au niveau parmi tous les pays petits États insulaires en développement. L'un des 8 pays des des petits États insulaires en développement qui est Haïti. Et Haïti est classé parmi les 163 pays sur 190 dans l'ordre de l'indice de développement humain. Donc, c'est pour vous dire le niveau de vulnérabilité du pays quand en matière environnementale, changement climatique et même économique, social. Donc, Haïti est un pays qui est caractérisé par les inondations intenses. La plus grande inondation qu'on a eue pour Haïti a connu 65 inondations majeures entre 1959 à nos jours. Et on espère, pour ces temps-ci, on est en période cyclonique, on va avoir pas mal de situations pareilles. Il y a les ouragans. Haïti a connu plus de 36 ouragans et tempêtes depuis 1954, des tremblements de terre. Plus récemment, le tremblement de terre qui a fait pas mal de morts en Haïti, qui est le séisme de 2010, qui a tué plus de 100 000 à 316 000 millions de personnes en Haïti. Donc, et autres catastrophes naturelles qu'on connaît tous, comme je viens de dire, cyclones, sécheresse et des glissements de terrain, qui récemment, quand j'étais même à la nappe Expo, il a eu vraiment des glissements de terrain en Haïti qui a causé pas mal de morts. Donc, et Acerbé par tout cela, Haïti a une instabilité politique vraiment difficile. C'est un pays qui est caractérisé pour sa instabilité politique, la corruption, la violence et l'insécurité. Et l'extrême vulnérabilité aux catastrophes naturelles font obstacle au développement social et économique du pays. Donc, Haïti est caractérisé sur le volet développement. On a un guide qui est le PSDH, c'est le guide stratégique, c'est-à-dire un plan de développement pour Haïti qui est adopté depuis en 2012, tandis que on commence vraiment à l'implémentation en 2015. Donc, c'est un agenda jusqu'à l'horizon 2030. Donc, c'est un document qui est appelé vraiment à réviser en si peu de temps. Donc, et qui comprend également les 17 objectifs des ODD qu'on a en Haïti. Prochain slide, s'il vous plaît. Ah, parfait. Donc, quand on parle de sécurité climatique en Haïti, on a fait cette étude-là avec plus de 60 institutions. On a eu les agences onusiennes en Haïti qui travaillent avec nous, comme le PNUD, les FAO, et on a le PNUE qui nous ont accompagnés en quelque sorte à réaliser cette étude. Donc, à partir de cette étude, on a créé un groupe de travail et ce groupe de travail s'est réuni presque tous les mois. Donc, pour discuter de la situation, en quelque sorte, comment continuer avec les activités qu'on est en train de réaliser en Haïti par rapport à l'insécurité. Désolé. Donc, et comment est impactée cette situation par, politiquement et économiquement à Haïti, comme vous le savez? nous sommes en crise, on ne peut pas le douter. Et donc, la crise a augmenté ce qu'on appelle l'insécurité alimentaire. Donc, c'est quelque chose qui est normal parce qu'on ne peut pas se déplacer et les villes plus reculées et d'Haïti qui produisent, parce que Haïti est un pays essentiellement agricole qui produit de la nourriture, on ne peut pas se déplacer d'une ville à d'autres villes pour faire passer les nourritures à temps voulu. Donc là, il y a vraiment selon les études, il y a plus de 4,9 millions d'habitants ou encore de personnes qui sont vraiment confrontées par et une faim aiguë en Haïti. Donc, certainement, l'aide humanitaire est nécessaire, mais des fois, cette aide n'aide presque pas, puisqu'il y a plus de 42% de la population haïtienne qui nécessite vraiment de l'aide humanitaire. Et des fois, c'est vraiment insuffisant pour eux, pour nous autres en Haïti. Donc, il y a d'autres problèmes encore, ce sont les gangs armés, comme c'est pas nouveau pour nous tous, puisque récemment, depuis février dernier jusqu'à nos jours, il y a des déplacements vraiment très restreints dans la capitale, surtout en Haïti, et on est confronté vraiment par des gangs et qui sont des fois, ils utilisent des activités vraiment très malsaines, c'est-à-dire violer les femmes et les violences sexuelles, etc., qui existent en Haïti entre. Et l'économie haïtienne qui se constate vraiment depuis 4 ans consécutive à une inflation qui dure. Et on a eu, en termes de politique encore, un grand problème, c'est avec l'assassinat de notre président et récemment, le 7 juillet 2021 qui est mort à travers des actes de banditisme que je peux dire dans le pays. Donc, si on dit que partout en Haïti, le changement climatique et la gestion ou encore les gestions environnementales ont été attribuées à la violence. Donc, et à la sécurité. Donc, c'est pour vous dire que comment cette étude a eu vraiment un impact sur nous autres, comment c'était important pour nous de réaliser cette étude, puisque nous autres, au niveau technique, qui ont des activités à réaliser, c'est toujours difficile pour nous de faire les activités. Donc, on travaille souvent avec le réseau mondial PNA, ils sont témoins. On a dû renvoyer des activités à chaque fois qu'on est en train vraiment d'organiser une activité par faute d'insécurité ou encore instabilité politique dans le pays. Donc, comme vous le savez, les problèmes sont là et les catastrophes causées par les chocs naturels qui sont induits par les changements climatiques et certains de problèmes de gouvernance persistants en Haïti et les effets du changement climatique qui ne cessent de dégrader notre environnement, qui pousse les populations vraiment à adopter des attitudes ou encore des pratiques d'adaptation néfastes et qui amplifient en quelque sorte la concurrence pour les ressources naturelles. Donc, on a, quand on a un problème vraiment et que la population n'arrive pas à évoluer, donc c'est la nature, les ressources naturelles qui subissent vraiment les conséquences. Donc, le changement climatique qu'on a et la dégradation de l'environnement poussent un nombre croissant de personnes à quitter et leur communauté. Donc, non seulement le problème de sécurité qui pousse les personnes à laisser ou encore à quitter leur communauté pour passer à d'autres endroits, mais également le lieu qu'ils habitent. Il y a tellement de constructions anarchiques, donc il y a un intempérie, c'est-à-dire il y a une cyclone et qu'il y a des inondations, il y a des glissements de terrain. Donc, ces gens-là sont obligés de se déplacer et se déplacer, c'est pour aller dans un autre endroit. Donc, ça là, c'est cause de la dégradation, la pression climatique et environnementale qui menace vraiment des moyens de subsistance, de protection de la population. Euh, Prochaine slide, s'il vous plaît. Donc, il y a des efforts et des efforts récents en matière d'adaptation et d'action climatique qui ont été menés dans le pays. Comme je vous ai dit, récemment, on a élaboré notre plan national d'adaptation où on a eu le support du réseau mondial, le PNA, avec toutes les communications qui ont été élaborées à travers ce processus. Donc, pour répondre aux défis de sécurité climatique, c'est-à-dire comment convaincre les populations à se protéger ou encore restaurer le milieu où ils habitent ou encore le milieu naturel, alors que leur principale préoccupation est de trouver suffisamment de nourriture ou encore se trouver un moyen de vivre, à reconstruire leur maison après une menace catastrophique, après un cyclone, un ouragan, etc. Donc, on a pas mal d'acteurs nationaux et internationaux qui comprennent la situation et qui tentent vraiment commencer à à faire face à ces risques liés au climat et à la sécurité environnementale. Mais cependant, il y a il y a des fois certaines d'entre elles qui ont suscité des grèves, c'est-à-dire vous venez et vous demandez à une personne à se déplacer, mais le gouvernement doit être à même à donner à cette personne-là un endroit où vivre. Des fois, on te déplace et on déplace la personne, mais la personne n'a pas vraiment un endroit où aller vivre. Donc, ça crée vraiment des problèmes supplémentaires et à la société haïtienne, encore une fois. Et ça peut même aboutir des fois à une résistance ouverte et violente contre l'État et les acteurs internationaux. Parce qu'il y a même des fois des gens qui disent, s'il arrive, on va se regrouper en communauté, donc pour les faire sentir qu'on ne va pas se déplacer. Donc, ce n'est pas toujours facile, mais on travaille. Cela dit, il y a de nombreux Haïtiens trouvant des moyens de s'adapter et de s'organiser autour de la nécessité de trouver des solutions, comme par exemple, solutions qui leur conviennent en s'attaquant au pire excès des impacts du changement climatique. Toutefois, ils réclament, ils pensent qu'ils ont vraiment la capacité de s'adapter eux-mêmes ou encore de répondre aux catastrophes naturelles. Mais des fois, les solutions qu'ils trouvent, c'est pas toujours la bonne, mais le gouvernement doit vraiment les accompagner dans le domaine. Donc, comment au niveau institutionnel, prochaine slide, comment au niveau institutionnel on répond vraiment à ces défis de sécurité climatique? Le gouvernement, comme je vous ai dit, a publié récemment le plan national d'adaptation au changement climatique dans divers secteurs. Donc, c'est-à-dire, mais il y a de mise en œuvre et vraiment qui se retardent, même si il y a des activités qui se font en termes d'adaptation au changement climatique en Haïti. Et nous autres, on a, par exemple, pour moi, je peux le dire, et le réseau PNA en est témoin parce qu'on a des activités qu'on devrait réaliser, on ne peut pas. Donc, pour réaliser ce genre d'activités-là, on est obligé donc, d'avoir des déplacements aériens. Et tandis que, on n'est pas trop loin de la ville ou encore de l'endroit qu'on va réaliser l'activité. C'est vrai qu'on est en train de faire des efforts, mais la situation sécuritaire est vraiment difficile de faire le lien entre le climat et la sécurité, ou encore, c'est-à-dire tout ça là reste flou au niveau même du gouvernement. Donc, la gestion environnementale est vraiment une priorité pour les Haïtiens au niveau local en raison des priorités concurrentes ou simplement de la tentative de survie, c'est-à-dire, donc, ils pensent que c'est rien pour eux, la coupe des bois pour construire une maison, mais tandis que quand tu habites en amont et dans les bassins versants, donc ça risque gros en aval pour le pays quand il y a des intempéries comme les ouragans, les cyclones, etc. Donc, au niveau international, on reçoit, oui, des aides. Il y a pas mal de ONG en Haïti, mais ce sont des choses que finalement qui ne donnent pas grand-chose en Haïti. Donc, on est toujours en train à la recherche du financement climatique, c'est-à-dire des aides qui arrivent, mais des fois insuffisantes pour, euh, pour répondre aux besoins des Haïtiens. Donc, le prochain stade est, laisse-moi voir. Donc, réponse au défi de la sécurité climatique pour en finir, je pense que c'est ma dernière slide. Donc, il faut voir que les premiers intervenants après une catastrophe sont généralement les voisins ou encore la famille, les amis, les fidèles et les organisations de base qui sont souvent là, axés sur la recherche de la méthodologie d'adaptation et surtout le programme de reboisement que Haïti a. Mais il y a entre autres, on connaît que la communauté haïtienne également et les organisations de la société civile qui s'efforcent, entre autres, pour restaurer et de protéger l'environnement naturel, notamment à travers les projets de reforestation, de conservation, et même établissent des liens entre le climat et la considération de la paix. Donc, c'est pour vous dire que on a fait cette étude entre le conflit qu'il y a au niveau de la politique en Haïti, au niveau gouvernemental. Puis, il y a l'insécurité. Quand on parle de l'insécurité, il y a les gangs armés qu'on devrait vraiment affronter tous les jours. C'est-à-dire, il y a des fois qu'on ne peut pas voyager à travers de manière aérienne, mais il faut prendre notre voiture et d'aller c'est affronter ces gens-là armés jusqu'aux dents ou encore on les paie pour qu'on puisse passer. Donc, sinon, il y a la population qui est vulnérable, qui ne reçoit pas d'informations suffisamment en termes de ce qu'on fait et au niveau environnemental et surtout le changement climatique, parce que c'est vrai qu'on a un problème dans le pays et qu'on a un problème dans le pays, mais également on a un problème dans le pays, mais le changement climatique ne s'arrête pas, donc ça avance, donc on doit avancer en même temps. Donc je vous remercie encore une fois et merci beaucoup pour cette opportunité.
Thank you so much, Gerty, for this holistic overview of the concrete challenges of Haiti. Now we will hear from Prakash Bista. Over to you, Prakash.
Thank you, Katerina. And good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everybody. And thank you to colleagues at IISD and the NAP Global Network for having invited UNDP to speak at this very important webinar. I'll try to keep my intervention brief, knowing that we're running out of time. Firstly, allow me to also congratulate you on this virtual launch of the new guidance on peace, conflict, and the NAP process. With climate change and conflict being two of the most significant challenges that we're facing today, this publication really could not have come at a more opportune moment. And I'd like to speak to some points on how UNDP is fostering resilience in countries and communities impacted by both climate and conflict under our strategic plan for 2022 to 2025. Some of this may be a repetition of what Alec has already presented, so I will try to skip over those. essentially, our strategic plan supports countries and communities in building resilience to a wide range of shocks and crises, including conflict, climate change, through a developmental approach across issues of conflict prevention and peace building. And this is done through better risk-informed interventions and choices, sensitive to multidimensionality of risk in order to mitigate conflict and climate risk, stabilize communities, and address forced displacement, such as in the example of the Sahel region. And this all aligns as well with our climate promise work, through which we support governments to enhance their NDCs under the Paris Agreement, which includes 50 fragile and conflict-affected countries and territories. Leveraging NDCs as an umbrella, UNDP brings together its infrastructure, networks, and a range of substantive efforts to provide comprehensive support on NDC implementation. As we all know, climate change and conflict intersect, creating a cycle of vulnerability and instability. Fragile and conflict-affected countries who already struggle with limited resources are usually the hardest hit by climate change, as we've already heard. Let's take, for example, the Arab region, just to change the regions here, which has experienced unprecedented cycles of droughts in the past few decades, leading to severe food shortages, loss of livelihoods, and displacement. Over 40% of the region's population is exposed to these climate-induced disasters. Alongside the spread of protracted conflicts and war, climate change is generating social vulnerability, exacerbating existing internal and international conflicts, and adding to the region's refugee and human displacement crisis. So why am I providing this example? It's essentially to show that climate change does worsen the underlying drivers of fragility and conflict, especially in the most vulnerable communities. And these communities, already struggling to cope with the conflict, find their capacities further strained by climate variabilities. But I think Madame Pierre's example from Haiti perfectly captured that situation. The OECD and IPCC also report that while fragile contexts account for about a quarter of the world's population, they are home to 3/4 of those living in extreme poverty. And this is also reiterated through a World Bank report. As Alec also mentioned earlier, countries in conflict also face significant barriers in addressing climate change. Resources are often diverted to immediate recovery and security needs, leaving little capacity for climate action. And this lack of prioritization leads to unrest, deteriorates social cohesion, and reverse hard-earned development gains. Which brings me to the how. How then do we tackle this very real, very significant challenge through our adaptation planning processes and through the adaptation planning lens? There are a number of entry points that have already been discussed, but I would just like to reiterate 3 key areas that we believe are imperative. And these are, 1, conflict-sensitive adaptation planning and policies. And here I cannot overemphasize the need for conflict-sensitive approaches in adaptation planning and policy making. Adaptation actions in conflict-affected and fragile contexts must address the root causes of both conflict and vulnerability. This means incorporating peace-building strategies and leveraging co-benefits, such as improved governance, resource management, and social cohesion. 2, regional and cross-border considerations as well. Climate change impacts do not respect borders, making regional and cross-border cooperation essential. Shared natural resources, such as water bodies or forests, require collaborative management to prevent conflict and promote sustainable adaptation. Early identification of peace-building needs in vulnerability assessments can enhance adaptation outcomes and foster regional stability. And the third one is on peace-building and adaptation co-benefits. Adaptation efforts offer unique opportunities for peace-building, but by prioritizing peace co-benefits in adaptation financing and planning, we can reinforce both climate resilience and social stability. Environmental peace-building practices highlight how technical adaptation solutions can serve as platforms for cooperation and peace. Now, how is UNDP going about this? And as part of the UN system of organizations, we are committed to ensuring, of course, that no one is left behind, especially in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. So our climate change adaptation and resilience building initiatives are designed to empower communities, transforming them from aid recipients to agents of change. And UNDP's extensive presence in these challenging environments underscores our dedication to supporting vulnerable populations. We work in 170 countries and territories, and our adaptation and resilience areas focus on food and water security. This is just to give you an example. Climate information and early warning systems, community empowerment, and partnerships. At the end of the last year, we also did a tally of what these have resulted in, particularly focusing on the fragile states, and UNDP's support to 42 fragile states with about 87 completed and 40 ongoing projects reached over 7.3 million people. And some of these initiatives included adoption of climate resilient agricultural practices by 500,000 people, improved access to water resources for another nearly 500,000, and enhanced climate information and early warning systems reaching about 2.3 million people. I have a few examples which I will probably share with the organizers instead of trying to go through now. But just to then an introspection also on how all of this effort is making any dent when it comes to adaptation and peace building nexus. And last year, we also conducted a study on trying to find out to which extent climate, peace, and security intersections were addressed in NAPs. And you already saw a more up-to-date trend from Alex's presentation on conflict as a driver for climate vulnerability. To complement his findings, about 10% of all the reference points to climate were marked as a threat or a risk multiplier in relation to natural resource-based conflicts. The most comprehensive references, and this is an important point as well, were made by those countries and territories that were already experiencing conflict dynamics, such as South Sudan, Somalia, Niger, Chad, Central African Republic, and Timor-Leste. However, even these NAPs do not comprehensively address how conflict may or may not interact with the underlying climate vulnerabilities or impede adaptation planning and implementation, which indicates that despite the progress made, barriers still persist. And these include inadequate climate finance, lack of market intelligence, sufficient climate and fragility risk information. And to overcome these challenges, we advocate for better access to finance, increase local governance capacity, and improve knowledge sharing across regions. In addition to this, we have also contributed to or led the predictive analytics studies in the Sahel and Latin America and the Caribbean regions to identify, among other issues, climate-induced mobility hotspots, which are usually impacted by cumulative climate, socioeconomic, and structural risk and vulnerabilities. And two of the top reasons in both of these studies point to food and water security as well as conflict. So in conclusion, let me also agree with the speakers before me and say that integrated and holistic approach to climate adaptation and peace building is crucial in addressing the complex challenges faced by fragile and conflict affected countries. By leveraging local knowledge and cross-border cooperation, fostering community empowerment, including in planning, to better target the root causes of conflict and vulnerability, and ensuring strategic partnerships in seeking out peace co-benefits in adaptation planning, we can build resilient and stable communities capable of withstanding future shocks. Thank you again for your attention, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Prakash. Very, very helpful, and I think we've had some very good presentations. I know we're running fast out of time, but at this point, we'd like to open up the conversation for questions from the audience. Please feel free to write your questions and comments in the chat box in Spanish, French, or English, and we will share these with the panelists to respond to. And while you write your questions, just to note that we will share the recording of this session and the presentation slides as a follow-up. Do we have any questions? While we're waiting, I'll put one to the panelist. What kinds of support do governments need for effective NAPs in conflict-affected context? Let me start with Alec.
Ooh, what kinds of support? I mean, it's a long list, I think, and probably very, very context specific. So some of the requests that we've had of late maybe shed some light on this. So we've had a country that has approached us that is still struggling to deal with instability in part of its territory, so not the whole country. But essentially, as a starting point, because we're talking about adaptation, of course, what they want to do is to undertake a climate risk vulnerability assessment, essentially to understand what the climate risks are before they try to formulate how they're going to respond to it, as is good practice in adaptation. But they've reached out to us for support in understanding how conflict dynamics, again, in a particular part of the country, could be influencing those risks and those vulnerabilities to climate change. So that integration of conflict dynamics is one particular and early form of support that I think could be given or extended to countries that are struggling with this, just so again that they have a more fulsome understanding of how those dynamics are influencing their climate vulnerability. Another piece of support that we've done of late has been around that question of institutional arrangements, and really trying to bring the NAP team of a particular country essentially in front of the peace building team. They recognized that the peace building apparatus within the country was about to renew their peace building plan because the previous one had run out after 5 years. So they were about to renew their peace building plan. For years, they had been talking about climate change being a contributing factor to the instability, but there was no signal that the next iteration of the peace building plan would integrate climate considerations and adaptation considerations as a potential peace building tool. So again, one form of small technical support that we offered them was to bring the NAP team to that peace building team and try to build some of those bridges between these two otherwise kind of siloed processes within government to ensure and make the case to the peace builders that adaptation really played a central role in how they were going to build a peace, and that they understood that adaptation was potentially, again, kind of a tool in the toolbox for peace building, because you're addressing, as Prakash was saying, many of the same shared drivers of climate vulnerability and conflict risk in a more holistic way. But I'll pass it over to the other panelists to discuss.
Thanks, Alec. If I may ask Gerty, coming from a small island developing state, what kind of support would your government need for effective NAPs in conflict affected context?
Merci beaucoup pour la question. Normalement, comme vous avez dit, Dr. Gray, nous sommes tous les deux en en commun et d'être nés dans un petit État et insulaire en développement. Et on connaît les mêmes catastrophes chaque année par rapport aux catastrophes naturelles et qui passent dans le pays. Même la majeure partie Et le problème, vu la situation ou encore la position géographique d'Haïti, nous sommes des fois les plus affectés. Donc, les plus affectés parce que nous sommes plus vulnérables par rapport aux constructions anarchiques qu'on a, parce que nos montagnes sont en construction constamment par la population qui cherche à évacuer des situations compliquées au niveau de la ville. Donc, ça nous donne un pays vraiment compliqué et qui est vraiment très vulnérable. Donc, l'une des choses qu'on a besoin, c'est une bonne gouvernance. Donc, en Haïti, on a un problème de gouvernance. Par exemple, une gouvernance en problématique climatique ou une gouvernance en problématique environnementale. Donc, c'est-à-dire définir vraiment et les institutions, un arrangement institutionnel qui savent vraiment ce que fait chacun dans le domaine et comment agir. Donc là, c'est un point vraiment très, très, très important pour nous autres en Haïti, c'est l'arrangement institutionnel ou encore avoir une gouvernance. Autre chose en Haïti, c'est vrai qu'on a un comité national sur les changements climatiques, mais cependant, on n'a pas de cadre légal. On a une politique, on n'a pas de cadre légal qui accompagne cette politique-là, à ce que tous les partis prenants respectent vraiment ce qui a été écrit dans cette politique. Donc, je pense que on a entre autres besoin de cadre légal et ce cadre légal-là pour définir la position de tout chacun, c'est-à-dire ce que chaque institution fait dans le domaine et pour aider le pays. En termes d'adaptation, moi-même, je pense que la population haïtienne ne savent pas vraiment ce qu'est l'adaptation ou encore comment bien faire l'adaptation, c'est-à-dire ne pas rester inactif, mais sinon, il faut être actif parce que le coût de l'inactif est beaucoup plus élevé que le coût d'actif. Donc, en ce sens-là, il faut vraiment que la population comprenne ce qui est vraiment à l'adaptation, c'est-à-dire en organisant vraiment des activités cohérentes qui va leur permettre vraiment à comprendre mieux comment faire l'adaptation et également ils doivent s'adapter eux-mêmes, oui, mais ils ont besoin également des institutions qui travaillent dans le domaine pour les accompagner pour qu'ils puissent aller vers l'avant. Donc, je pense que également, on a besoin d'une adaptation au niveau local, puisque en Haïti, jusqu'à présent, on a fait notre processus PNA ou encore notre plan adaptation PNA. Oui, on a identifié 4 secteurs vraiment importants dans le PNA, mais au niveau local, avec les municipalités, on doit vraiment agir avec eux pour qu'ils puissent comprendre vraiment ce que c'est l'adaptation et également qu'ils apprennent à s'adapter et en même temps à protéger leur environnement parce que sans leur environnement, il y a des problèmes. Donc, en Haïti, et ça, c'est une chose. Et l'autre chose, c'est le problème de financement que connaît notre pays, c'est-à-dire quand un pays n'a pas un budget national qui répond vraiment à ses exigences, donc il est très difficile d'avoir de réussir encore dans ces activités qu'ils entreprennent. Donc là, c'est un problème vraiment de subsistance, un problème économique, social, de tout ça là. On en a besoin et des activités concrètes pour le pays pour qu'on puisse vraiment voir les résultats et ça marche. Donc là, on peut dire vraiment qu'on est en train de travailler. Merci.
Thank you so much, Gerty. And we know we are up with the hour, but perhaps if people have a bit more time to take a few minutes from the chat. For instance, we have a question from Rushil. Hello, everyone. I wanted to understand what development cooperation could learn from your findings, especially the ones who are working in the readiness space. What are the key changes you would like to see in their approach? maybe Prakash, I'm not sure if you would have some ideas on that, otherwise open to everyone to answer.
Thank you again, Katerina. But there are a number of questions there related to financing. I see, particularly related to how one might link the adaptation planning with the peace building space, as well as loss and damage. So maybe I can just give if you wouldn't mind, give some insights there. So obviously, let me start with the last one. The loss and damage fund is obviously a separate fund, which is trying to also look at what is the additionality that would be required in order to meet the funding requirements under the loss and damage fund. So it would really have to try to show that if countries are seeking this access to this fund, would need to show that this all the AMA principle, which is the avert, minimize, and address, is met sequentially, so that what you're seeking is really the loss and damage aspect of it. Which, but anyway, the fund is not yet fully established in a sense that it's still being negotiated. So we're yet to see how that will work. But obviously there will be linkages. There will be a fine line between adaptation and loss and damage, and that could be, of course, accessed separately. In terms of the peace building work and adaptation, there is a fund for peace building that, from the United Nations as well, which is accessible in trying to make these deliberate linkages between adaptation and conflict. And of course, a lot of the traditional climate funds also provide support to this type of activities. Maybe I stop there. Perhaps others have some experience in the space as well.
Thank you so much, Prakash. And I'm seeing people have other commitments as well, as we're past the hour. But I think maybe we can close this for now. Of course, we want to keep engaging with you, and feel free to reach out via email to each of us. But I think for now, we want to thank all the panelists for your great inputs and sharing of your experience and expertise, for taking the time. And also thank you to the audience. We'll share the recording and the contact details with you, and we're looking forward to seeing and speaking to you soon.
Thank you, Katharina, and thank you to our panelists.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Take care.
Bye-bye. Have a wonderful rest of your day.